First, a preamble. In response to a request, I'm trying to figure out how to make this thing simultaneously keep high audio fidelity, not have the microphone be too onerous, and also apparently allow you to see my hands. So we'll see what we can do. One of the conversation points that's come out over the past 24 hours has been a lot of talk about Jubilee Design. And so what I thought might be interesting is to spend a little bit of time on that. And if you think about Jubilee Design, we've got more or less two big distinct chunks. One chunk is sort of how do we get the first one? We're sort of constipated. We haven't got a good Jubilee Design in place, and we need to figure out a way to get from where we are to some new place. Then, in that new place, how do we actually design it so it becomes elegant? Right? So we're going to kind of be relatively inelegant, and then hopefully be more elegant. And so let me lay out a few basic ideas. The first is that again, sort of the point of the Jubilee is in fact to generate something like right relationship between the domain of the complicated and the domain of the complex, recognizing that both are real. So what do I mean by that? Let me just sort of quickly recapitulate those notions. So a forest, a natural organic forest, is complex, and a farm is complicated. Right? A farm is a creation where you create certain kinds of boundaries that have something like finite state rules, i.e. I can point to a particular location and say this crop goes there. And I can get a very fine-grained complicated system, i.e. it has a whole lot of rules, particularly with computational systems that can have lots and lots and lots, or I can have a very coarse-grained small, complicated system like tic-tac-toe. But that's the idea, right? And a complex system is, first and foremost, prior to. All complicated systems are extractions from or boundaries placed on top of complexity. So you cannot have complicatedness without complexity, but you can have complexity without complicatedness. We did before humans existed. Okay, so the idea here then is to say, okay, look, we've always got these two things going on. We've got the complex, which we might call like the human or even the hominid. And then we've got, or the indigenous, maybe even more powerful. And then we've got the complicated, rule of law, the defined, civilization as a human designed construct, design. And they're always going to be in a certain relationship. And one of the real problems we run into is that the complicated, the finite, the bounded, by the way, the entropic, is always going to come to an end. There's no way to maintain a perpetual complicated system. It just sort of has a wide variety of externalities that it throws into the complex. It has a lot of problems that develop in terms of what I call sclerosis or corruption or corrosion on its interior. And so sort of maintaining a complicated system gets harder and harder and harder. And by the way, it becomes less and less well fitted to the complex system it sits on top of. And so in some finite time, it has to reboot and kind of be plowed under back into the complex. And so that's like a fundamental premise. And if you want, we can go into why that is and how it works. It's interesting and maybe important. But the problem is that we actually have wrong relationship between these two, that we have a bad habit of allowing the complicated to take itself as being the whole story. And in fact, to actually extract more and more and more from the complex, so that it's not just that we ideologically believe that the complicated is just reality, but in fact, we must do so because the only way for us to meet our needs is in the context of the complicated system that we've designed and developed. And one of the points that I've made is that we're now sitting at the tail end of a long version of that. So we are highly addicted to our complicated systems. So even as they are dysfunctional and end of life and need to be plowed under, we kind of can't, or at least it's going to be very challenging for us to do that because we've taken ourselves very far away from the complex. And this point's going to come back importantly in terms of Jubilee Design. So if we take a look at Jubilee Design, we look at it from the point of view of what we call the interiority of the complicated and the relationality between the complicated and the complex, and both are important. So in the interiority of the complicated, we're looking at how do we design something in the way that we build our complicated system so that it's A, difficult to capture and game, And B is very, very difficult to inhibit its own end of life, its own time to Jubilee. Right? So imagine just kind of the contemporary environment. Imagine that our entire civilization was built on top of a whole bunch of, sort of Ethereum-based smart contracts or something like that, but it's all software. And at the root, like at the most fundamental level of that computational structure, there's a clock. And in 50 years, the entire system just reboots itself, regardless of human agency. That would be an example of what it would mean to build something in at the bottom such that the reboot itself is the most fundamental rule. I'll get back to an example that's a little bit closer to home in a moment. And then we can think about how do we build that complicated system so that people's natural habits, the way that people naturally go around exploring a complicated system, balancing their local advantage, their individual advantage for themselves or the groups and tribes that they consider to be part of their kind of their close-knit group, and for the global advantage, for the advantage of the larger whole of which they are part. Right? And I think in the previous video I talked about the kind of the natural arc of S-curves. And an S-curve, as it turns out, happens in the exploration of any new domain, any new complicated system. Anytime that you actually create a boundary and create a complicated system, you will see an S-curve. And that S-curve has to do with Peircean firstness, secondness, and thirdness, for those who like that kind of stuff, which has to do with something like the relationship between the effort involved in exploring the potential of the domain, how hard it is to explore, how much we've explored, how well we understand how to explore it, the amount of potential remaining to be found in the domain, and the amount of energy that we have to expend. I guess that's kind of tied to the first. So in the beginning, there's a lot of potential. We haven't really found anything. But it's also really hard to explore because we don't really have any orienting basis. We don't understand the domain. So first principles, like we're really looking for the basic lay of the land. So there's a lot of effort. But when we find something, what we find is usually really big, really important, really valuable in terms of the context of that domain. And then over some period of time, we get expertise. We get better at navigating the domain. And while we've picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit, there's still a lot of potential left. And so we kind of get into the exploitation phase. And this is the ramping up of the S-curve. And then as we get to the third phase, the thirdness, frankly, the potential is beginning to get played out. And so even though we're really good at playing in the domain, the amount of work we have to do, we have to get more and more fine-grained to kind of extract and find the pieces that are left out there. And so the amount of energy that we have to place, even though we're really good at it, is higher and higher and higher until we've kind of tapped it out. We've reached the top of the S-curve. Now, human behavior maps to this, right? So when you enter a new frontier, when you enter into a new domain, the sort of the value of collaboration and cooperation, we kind of all have to work together to even get exploration happening. And there's not a whole lot of things in the interior. There's not a whole lot of sort of possibility. There's not a lot, the pie that doesn't even exist when you first show up in the domain. So just baking the pie and making the pie happen is where everybody's attention is focused. So you don't actually have a lot of defection problems in a new frontier. Equally, because you don't have a lot of defection value, the defection niche is itself very immature, meaning people haven't begun to get sophisticated at figuring out how to defect in the context of the new domain. Think of this like almost like two circles. One circle is the domain itself. The second circle is the domain of defection inside the domain itself. And so when the domain itself is novel and new, the defection niche is also novel and new, and therefore not much going on. As you move through firstness to secondness, the returns on cooperation continue to show up as being very high. And so there's not a whole lot of, like if I have a choice between cooperating and getting rewarded that way or defecting and getting rewarded that way, it's still on balance very much my benefit to cooperate. And also, therefore, the energy expended on exploring the defection niche is still relatively poor, and so the ability of the system, the society, to police defection is still relatively high compared to the sophistication of defection techniques. So you still actually have you still have relatively low defection, even though the value of defection is going up. But of course, as the value of defection is going up, more investment is being made in the technologies of defection. So you see something happening inside the defection niche. And simultaneously, as you're moving through secondness towards thirdness, the return on investment in search and just collaboration, cooperation, trying to figure out how to expand the pie is actually beginning to decrease, while the value on the interior, our ability to just sort of churn on stuff we've already figured out and exploit, is also increasing. So the size of the pie is not growing, but the pie is big. So now, of course, defection starts to become a good strategy. And once the defection niche crosses a certain threshold, you can defect and not get caught. It becomes an obligate strategy, and you've kind of moved into the collapse phase of that particular structure. So the point there is that actually is maybe something like natural law, like it's just straightforward the way people will behave in these kinds of contexts. And it's useful to think about how you design your Jubilee system, like the way that the Jubilee structure is designed, to take advantage of that. Can you design it so that by the time you're moving through the middle of secondness, the game theoretic program is actually moving the attention of people away from, instead of defecting here, what I'll actually do is think about how I start moving my energy and attention outside of this domain. Why worry about a domain that in fact is going to implode in 10 years because the Jubilee is going to trigger and evaporate it? By the time my capacity to take control of the domain is strong enough, the Jubilee will be over. It'll be worthless to have. And you can think about like as the thirdness increases, as you start moving to the top of the S-curve, and the defection niche has actually gotten rather robust, coordination costs are actually quite high. So coordination, whether you're coordinating to grow the pie or coordinating to control the pie, it's still high because everybody's in a defection mode. You can't trust liars and spies and whatnot. And so, if you design the Jubilee so that the coordination costs necessary to turn it off or to game it are above the threshold that people are able to get to as you get towards the end of the domain. So as defection is going up and the clock is getting closer to zero, it's sort of the whole game theoretic structure is trying to game this system just doesn't make any sense. I have to go somewhere else. Okay, so that's one side of it. The other side of it is to say, okay, modally, remember, we've got the complex over here. So I've thought about how do I manage the interior of the complicated with my Jubilee structure? Well, how do I also maintain the exterior, the complex, with my same Jubilee structure? These are both parts of the same design. So here, there's basically two considerations. One consideration is you want to maintain the integrity of the complex, its own capacity to be and to do and to hold, and the value or capacity of people to actually meet their needs in that mode. Ideally, you want your complex to thrive while your complicated is doing its thing. Back to our example of the Monopoly game. You want to be able to sort of have friendship be rich and wholesome while you're also playing Monopoly. Like if you get so addicted, like this crazy sort of meth, coked up Monopoly game that's gone on for 3 years, and we've kind of lost track of how to just do human things. We've sort of become completely addicted to this crazy ass Monopoly game. Then it's going to be the complex has been broken. But it's not obvious it has to be that way, that we can actually bind our complicated game and say, okay, a portion of life happens over here, but another portion of life, and frankly a bigger and more important portion, happens over here and isn't managed by the same mechanisms as the complicated. So it's not horrifying to imagine just leaving this game and coming back over here. And then equally, it has to actually maintain enough power to, let's say, enforce the Jubilee, even if this gets captured. So we design the interior of the Jubilee structure, the complicated structure, so that it's hard to capture, both structurally as well as game theoretically. But also we make sure that the complex has the capacity to press the reboot button if the reboot button really needs to be pressed. And the elite structures over here have the capacity to prevent that from happening. All right. So let's talk about a concrete example of a previous effort to do this. It's called the Constitution of the United States. So if you look at it, the Constitution itself is very much like my complicated system, right? Checks and balances, the effort to sort of divide power into different domains and modes of election and time frames and cycle. That's all some effort to make the complicated system of the constitutional mode of government difficult to capture. And notice it actually includes a Jubilee in it, which is, of course, the Constitutional Convention, or at least amendments. But the Constitutional Convention is a straight-up Jubilee. Like if you can make your way all the way to that, all the rules are off. We're in a whole new mode. We don't really know exactly how it's going to play out. And so whoever happened to maybe have captured or achieved established power inside the context of the pre-convention isn't guaranteed that they're going to maintain that through the convention. They had a design error, though. They made the convention opt-in, which is exactly the wrong direction. Because as you need it, as the system becomes more and more captured and more gamed, and by the way, also more unstable and ill-fitted and whatnot, coordination capacity goes down, and so the ability to rise to an opt-in goes down just when you need it. Imagine what would have happened if the Constitutional Convention was in fact an opt-out. Like at every presidential election or every 4 or whatever, something like that, there was a supermajority vote that had to vote against the Constitutional Convention, or it was just going to happen, right? So like right now, 2020, in addition to voting in all the elections we voted on, 75% of the population had to say no to a Constitutional Convention, or it just by default happened. In that case, we probably would have one. Right? It's unlikely right now that you could get 75% of Americans to agree on anything. And so by default, you'd be moving into this Constitutional Convention, which, by the way, would change the game theoretic calculus across the entire field radically. Anyway, so think about that in terms of design, right? Opt-in and opt-out, we know there's a big difference in that. And coordination capacity is a thing that we can predict. But the founders weren't left with just the Constitution. If you look at the Bill of Rights is largely about maintaining the integrity of the complex vis-a-vis the complicated. So, hey guys, we've got we the people, we've got the notion of just because it's written in the Constitution doesn't mean that's all there is. It doesn't take away from the powers that are invested in the people, which are more fundamental, right? Invested by inalienable rights by the Creator, and always have the basic right of exiting any kind of governance structure and kind of complicated civilization structure, which is the complex. And so we had things like separation of church and state. The state here representing the complicated, the church representing the complex. That's important. The church doesn't really fundamentally map to a dogmatic, complicated ecclesiastical structure that just happens to be about kind of made up supernatural things. The church, in its most fundamental sense, represents the kind of the complex human livingness. Like the sacred represents the notion of the commons as a fundamental. Right? It's humans in non-human mediated, right? Non-human mediated life is the church. Whether or not you believe me on that, it doesn't matter. Just take that as an example of the notion. And then, of course, you've got things like the Second Amendment. Right? The Second Amendment is about grounding the capacity of the people to be able to resist any degree of capture by the state apparatus. Right? So to the degree to which the ability to maintain the integrity of the state hasn't been up, and literally even the military can be used against us, we have the Second Amendment, which says, hey, the people have to have the capacity to resist that. The complex has to have the capacity to enforce a reboot against the complicated in case they need to. So you've got things like, the I think it's the 11th and 12th Amendments that specifically say, hey guys, the power ultimately invested in the people hasn't been taken away. That's still there, in fact, more fundamental. You get things like the Second and First Amendments that are designed to maintain that integrity. Interestingly enough, actually, in just the legal structure, we've got things like the Militia Act, which stand kind of in between. Right? The Militia Act says, hey, by the way, it's kind of in that zone between the complicated and the complex, where if we have reached the point where the complicated structure is so gamed that we can't have confidence that even our formal law enforcement and military institutions are going to operate on behalf of the complex, we have the ability to call up the full militia. Formally, it's still inside the structure, but it's kind of another check, part of the checks and balances. And by the way, if that doesn't work, and we can't find a way to get to a constitutional convention, we still have the sort of the Declaration of Independence and the 11th and 12th Amendments and the Second Amendment that says, sorry guys, the complex is still there and still fundamental, and we always have the more basic right to exit any complicated system. It has to be, and we've maintained at least to some degree the capacity to do so, right? Both the formal and the capacitant. So it's sort of an example of a previous effort 250 years ago, and that's probably not a fast enough cycle. I think if we'd had our cycles be a little bit cleaner, a little bit more elegant, and a little bit tighter together, we may be in a very different place than we are right now. So what does that imply for how we move out of our current place? Well, probably some of the tools that I just described, or plausibly some of the tools that I just described. A constitutional convention would be interesting. If necessary, some degree of use of the Second Amendment and or the militia may in fact be part of it. The point being that fundamentally, the conscious awareness of the more fundamentalness of the complex, and both the ability and in many cases the necessity of the complex to reboot the complicated when the complicated is no longer sovereign over itself, right? It actually has become captured or gamed or corrupt or dysfunctional in some way. One is the notion of permission. Hey guys, we've got permission to do this. The second notion is necessity. Okay, we are in a place where we need to do this. And the third notion finally is capacity. How do we go about doing it effectively and with the most elegant approach possible? And fortunately in the United States, we actually have a number of mechanisms that are baked into the Constitution, into the laws, where we could execute on it legally. And then of course we've got the basic model. At the end of the day, the entire Constitution does sit on top of the popular sovereignty, the will of the people. So we have the deepest possible basis, although by no means the easiest or the most elegant possible basis for kind of exiting a complicated system that may have been too captured. And then, by the way, what I would say is that a big part of that story is a fundamental orientation and a revivification of the commons, of the complex, right? Remember, looping back, frankly, the bigger problem we have right now isn't so much recalcitrance of elites as much as it is the addiction to our complicated system. Like the average person doesn't have a community that they can rely on. They don't have, and their communities don't have a network of communities that can actually support human livingness outside of economic transactions mediated by monetary systems governed by governance systems. And if you don't have that, you're kind of in a bad place. So revivifying the commons is very much like up front and center. And what's interesting is that as we rediscover how to common in general, we simultaneously revivify the commons and dramatically upgrade our capacity as a people, as a complexity, to stand vis-a-vis the potentially recalcitrant, elite-captured, complicated system. So as sort of like a general theory, focus on that. And as we get better and better and better at that, we have more capacity to force the reboot, and the reboot is a lot less scary because we actually have more real, complex commons that we can rely on and aren't as addicted to the complicated system.